The year was 218 BC. The wind tearing through the Alpine passes sliced like knives against skin. Men from dozens of tribes, Numidians, Libyans, Celts, Iberians, huddled behind their shields, their faces blistered and raw. Pack animals slipped on the ice. Mules tumbled off cliffs. The elephants, terrified by the cold and the height, trudged forward with steaming breath like ghosts from a forgotten age. It was madness. No sane general would attempt to bring an army over the Alps in winter. But Hannibal Barca wasn't following the rules. Carthage had chosen its champion well. The son of Hamilcar, raised on hatred of Rome, Hannibal had sworn before the gods to destroy the Republic. And now, after smashing Roman allies in Spain and crossing the treacherous Rhone, he did what no enemy had done. He marched an entire war machine into Italy from the north. The Alps weren't just mountains. They were a wall Rome believed impassable. Even when scouts reported Hannibal's movements, the Senate dismissed them. It wasn't possible, they said. Not with elephants. Not in the snow. Not with an army. But it was. When Hannibal descended from the mountains, his army was battered but intact. He had lost men, yes, but what remained were warriors hardened by ice and fire. The Romans expected stragglers, deserters, corpses. What they got was an invasion, and the war was no longer in Spain. It was at their doorstep. Trebia came first. The Roman consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus, eager for glory, rushed into battle without understanding his enemy. Hannibal baited him with skirmishers, then struck from ambush as the Romans crossed the freezing river. Wet, shivering, and disordered, the Roman legions were overwhelmed by Hannibal's cavalry and hidden troops. Thousands died. Rome's pride cracked, but Hannibal wasn't finished. He marched south, deeper into Italy, burning farms and towns, drawing Rome's armies into a long pursuit. At Lake Trasimene, he struck again, using mist and terrain. He lured the Roman army under Gaius Flaminius into a narrow defile. Then, from hills and woods, his forces fell like a thunderclap. The lake trapped the Romans against its shores. There was no line, no escape. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. 15,000 Romans died in hours. The consul's body was never found. 2 battles, 2 disasters, and Hannibal still wasn't slowing down. He didn't just defeat Roman armies. He humiliated them. He exposed their rigidity, their arrogance. He fought with deception, speed, and improvisation. Rome fought by the book, and Hannibal set the book on fire. His army was a hybrid force. African infantry with discipline, Celtic warriors with fury, Iberians with tenacity, cavalry with unmatched maneuverability. They didn't just march, they stalked. They didn't fight for Rome's ideals. They fought for survival, for gold, and for the brilliance of the man who led them. Panic spread through the Republic. No city in Italy felt safe. Hannibal didn't just break Rome's armies. He broke their rhythm. He forced them to react, to chase, to fear. But he wasn't trying to destroy cities. He was trying to shatter morale. He spared towns that defected. He punished those that resisted. He wanted allies, not ash. But Rome was too proud to yield. The Senate, reeling from the disasters, appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus. His answer was not to fight, but to delay. Avoid pitched battle, burn supplies, harass flanks, deny Hannibal glory. It was smart, but unpopular. Romans wanted blood for blood, and Hannibal knew it. He kept moving, devastating Italy's countryside, drawing the legions after him. For over a year, he maneuvered without defeat. And still, he waited for Rome to make a mistake. They made it at Cannae. The year was 216 BCE, and Rome had had enough. The Senate, stung by humiliation, seething with fury, abandoned caution. Fabius' delaying tactics, though effective, were seen as cowardice. Rome needed a victory, and it needed one now. The people demanded it. The aristocracy demanded it. They didn't just want Hannibal gone. They wanted him obliterated. So they gathered a force that dwarfed anything Rome had ever sent into the field. Nearly 90,000 strong, 80,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and thousands more support personnel. 2 consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, were given joint command. It was a political compromise and a dangerous one. Paulus, cautious and seasoned, wanted restraint. Varro, bold and impulsive, promised a direct assault that would crush Hannibal once and for all. Every other day, command would shift between them. A fault line ran down the center of the command structure, and it would crack open under the weight of their own confidence. The army moved southeast toward Apulia, toward the town of Cannae. Flat and wide, the terrain around Cannae was chosen deliberately. Open plains, no forests, no rivers to cross, no hills for ambush. Rome wanted a frontal battle, a straight, unambiguous fight where sheer numbers would decide the outcome. Hannibal let them come. He didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. He smiled. Cannae was the culmination of everything Hannibal had learned, everything he had planned. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a trap waiting to spring. He knew Rome's doctrine. Their legions operated like a battering ram. Tight formations, steady pressure, crushing momentum. But they relied on space and order. Deprive them of either, and they became slower, less lethal. Hannibal arranged his forces accordingly. At the center of his line, he placed his weakest troops, Celts and Spaniards, fierce but poorly armored, men with no illusions. They were there to bend, to absorb. On their flanks stood his African heavy infantry, disciplined, shielded, sharp-edged. Veterans of past campaigns. Hardened, silent, ready. At the wings, Hannibal stationed his cavalry, Numidians on one side, Iberians and Gauls on the other. Mobile, aggressive, unrelenting. He formed his army in a shallow crescent, with the center bulging forward toward the Romans. It was an invitation, a shape designed to be broken. He wanted the Roman juggernaut to see that soft belly and rush in, confident and blind. And Rome gave him exactly that. On the morning of battle, under the harsh Apulian sun, the Romans advanced. Dust rose like fog. The legions, packed tighter than usual, moved in mass. Varro was in command that day. Impulsive, aggressive Varro, and he ordered a full direct assault. Hannibal's crescent formation caught the blow, reeled, then slowly began to fold inward. Not collapse, fold. The center gave ground, foot by foot, like a retreat. But it wasn't. It was alignment, positioning. The deeper the Romans pushed, the narrower their formation became. They didn't notice it, but they were funneling themselves into a vice. As the Roman center drove forward, Hannibal's wings began to swing shut. His African infantry on the flanks didn't just hold, they turned inward. The crescent became a horseshoe. The Romans were now surrounded on three sides. And then came the final blow. Hannibal's cavalry, having smashed the Roman horse on the wings, didn't chase stragglers. They wheeled around, regrouped, and charged into the Roman rear. The trap closed. What had started as a straightforward assault became a nightmare. The Roman legions, masters of the open field, were now packed so tightly that they could barely lift their arms. Rear ranks were crushed into the backs of those in front. Shields overlapped, not for defense, but out of suffocating proximity. There was no maneuver, no command. The commanders themselves, Paulus, Varro, tribunes, were lost in the chaos. Some fought, others vanished into the crush. The circle tightened. Dust and screams filled the air. Men were trampled underfoot. Spears stabbed from every direction. The wounded fell and were crushed beneath the living. The living slipped on blood and entrails. Blades flashed in every pocket of space. And Hannibal, high on horseback, watched the carnage unfold with cold calculation. It wasn't just a slaughter, it was an erasure. The slaughter began as formation collapsed. Then it transformed into something worse. Not a clash of arms, but a slow, grinding, methodical extinction. At the center of the Roman formation, panic spread like fire, but there was nowhere for it to burn. Men couldn't flee. They couldn't reposition. The rear was sealed. The flanks were walls of steel. And the front, the one place they thought they were winning, was now a mass of dead and dying comrades, their momentum stolen. Hannibal's Africans closed in, shoulder to shoulder, shields locked. They didn't rush. They didn't break ranks. They stepped forward, impaling, slicing, stepping over corpses. Every thrust was controlled. Every movement coordinated. The Celts and Spaniards, now behind the Roman front lines, rejoined the battle from the sides. The double envelopment had become a compression, a slow tightening of a human noose. Inside the Roman trap, air itself became scarce. Dust choked every breath. The stench of blood, of feces, of iron and heat overwhelmed the senses. Voices were reduced to gasps and moans. Swords could no longer be swung. There was no room. Soldiers tried to push outward, to find space, to clear a path, but the mass was too dense. No signals could be given. No commanders could be seen. Officers died unrecognized, trampled by their own. Entire units dissolved into the anonymous press of the dying. Some men dropped their weapons and clawed at the bodies around them just to fall low enough to breathe. Others tried to dig through the dead, forming hollows beneath the corpses to escape the crush above. In the outer circle, the slaughter was fast, swift cuts, spear thrusts, clean deaths. But inside, where pressure crushed rib cages and men suffocated standing up, it was slower. A death by inches, 1,000 tiny torments. Limbs snapped, armor dented inward, faces smashed against the backs of heads. There was no heroism left, only agony. Still, the killing continued. Hannibal's men began to tire, not from resistance, but from repetition. Their arms ached. Their swords grew slick with blood and harder to grip. The bodies piled high, slippery and unsteady beneath their feet. But discipline held. The Libyan infantry did not break ranks or shout triumph. They had seen many battles. They had never seen one like this. The Numidian cavalry, once the terror of the flanks, now hunted stragglers beyond the ring, pursuing survivors who fled in scattered panic. Most never made it far. Few even tried. The battle had lasted for hours, but the decisive moments had ended within the first hour. What followed was not combat. It was cleansing. By nightfall, the battlefield was unrecognizable. A wide plain that had once echoed with Roman footsteps was now silent, but for crows and flies. Blood had turned the dust to mud. Corpses blanketed the ground so densely that one could walk hundreds of paces without touching earth. Some men were still alive beneath the dead, gasping weakly, unable to move. Others had collapsed from exhaustion, covered in gore, their minds broken by what they had seen. The rivers nearby ran red and carried limbs downstream. At least 50,000 Romans had died. Some estimates climbed higher. Among them were both consuls, though only Paulus was confirmed dead. Nearly 80 senators, men of patrician blood, the future of Rome, lay among the fallen. The Roman elite had come to crush Hannibal. Instead, they had been buried together in a single open grave. Hannibal's losses were minimal, perhaps 6,000 or 8,000, mostly among his Celts and Spaniards, those who had formed the sacrificial center. But those men had done their duty. They had bought the time and the space for the hammer to fall. It was the greatest tactical victory in ancient history. Hannibal had destroyed an army not by superior numbers, but by perfect execution. His trap had worked so flawlessly that it seemed unnatural, even divine. He hadn't just won, he had rewritten what warfare could be. But Hannibal did not celebrate. There were no feasts, no great proclamations. He ordered his troops to rest, to guard the wounded, to gather equipment. He walked the battlefield alone that evening, seeing firsthand what he had wrought. Victory had a cost, even for him. By dawn the next day, the sun rose not on a battlefield, but a slaughterhouse. The air was thick with decay already beginning. Birds circled overhead. Packs of wild dogs gathered at the fringes. The armor on the dead glinted faintly in the light. Thousands of breastplates, helmets, greaves, now resting atop blood-soaked corpses. The Roman eagle standards, once carried with pride, lay half-buried in the flesh of their bearers. Hannibal had won the most complete battlefield victory in Roman history, but even he knew what had just happened was beyond war. It was annihilation. His officers approached, some silent, others in disbelief. Hannibal, his cavalry commander, urged immediate action. "Let me go now with the cavalry, and within 5 days, we shall dine in Rome." Hannibal didn't answer at first. He stared toward the north, toward the horizon that led to the Republic's capital. He knew what Hannibal meant. Strike now, while Rome was paralyzed, while its gates were unguarded, while the Senate was still counting its dead. It was the logical next step, but Hannibal refused. He wasn't interested in sacking cities. He was interested in breaking alliances. Rome's strength wasn't in its walls. It was in its network. Instead, he sent messengers to Rome's allies across Italy. He sent envoys to Samnium, to Apulia, to Campania, to the Etruscans. Rome is broken, they were told. Hannibal is now the master of Italy. Some city-states considered it. A few, Capua most notably, switched sides. But most did not. The horror of Cannae had terrified them, but not in the way Hannibal had hoped. They saw what he could do, but they also saw what Rome was capable of surviving. If even that wasn't enough to kill the Republic, then perhaps nothing was. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the news arrived like a thunderclap. Survivors stumbled into the city days later, numb, blood-stained, some half-mad from the experience. They carried no weapons. They had fled without shields, without shoes, with nothing but trauma. The Senate listened in silence as the numbers were reported. Nearly half of Rome's entire military manpower gone in one day. 120 of their most experienced military officers dead. Generals, tribunes, centurions wiped out. Rome did not collapse, but it bent. No mourning was allowed. No funerals were held. No weeping in public. The Senate feared despair more than death. Orders were given to recruit new legions immediately. Conscription age was lowered. Slaves were offered freedom if they took up arms. Criminals were pardoned if they joined the legions. Even children of the equestrian class were enlisted early, sent into training before their voices had fully deepened. The city bled itself financially as well. The Senate taxed its members to fund the war. Rich families emptied their coffers, melted silver heirlooms, donated horses. Rome had always fought with discipline. Now it would fight with desperation. Yet even in defeat, Rome learned. Cannae had exposed everything wrong with Roman military doctrine. Rigid lines, predictable tactics, overconfidence. That would change. New commanders would emerge from the ashes. Men like Scipio, young and untested, but watching closely. They would remember what Hannibal had done, and they would begin to adapt. For now, Hannibal had free reign across southern Italy. He wintered in Capua, a city that welcomed him as a liberator. His army rested, resupplied, and swelled with volunteers. But with each passing month, it became clear that his plan had stalled. The Italian cities weren't rising up in rebellion the way he had expected. Rome, though gasping, was not surrendering. And, crucially, Hannibal lacked siege equipment. He couldn't take Rome by force. He had destroyed their army, but not their capacity to resist. Worse, his supply lines were growing thin. Carthage, his homeland, remained cautious. They sent him some reinforcements, but not enough. The political elite in Carthage feared provoking Rome into attacking Africa directly. They didn't see what Hannibal saw, that the heart of Rome had been exposed, and only boldness could finish the job. So he waited. He campaigned. He offered peace. He tried to erode Rome through prolonged occupation. But the Roman spirit, beaten to the ground, was beginning to crawl back up. And Cannae, instead of being the final blow, became something else entirely. A warning that Rome would carry in its blood for generations. In the months that followed the devastation at Cannae, the physical echoes of the battlefield faded under the sun. But in Rome, the consequences pulsed in every corridor of power. The Senate chambers, once confident and unyielding, now operated in grim determination. Senators no longer asked how to win, but how to survive. Diplomats who once boasted of Rome's dominance now begged allies not to abandon the cause. Letters were dispatched urgently to remaining loyal cities. Latium, Etruria, Umbria, Picenum, urging them to stay faithful, to understand that Rome still stood. The Republic, though kneeling, still breathed. But Hannibal wasn't idle. He moved his army strategically across southern Italy, seizing supply depots, cutting trade routes, sabotaging Roman garrisons. He offered generous terms to cities that defected and brutal punishment to those that resisted. And some, disillusioned with Rome's losses, switched sides. Capua, second only to Rome in size and wealth, opened its gates and offered him hospitality. There, Hannibal took winter quarters and luxury, his army resting amid marble baths and open forums. The change from battlefield to comfort was jarring. His soldiers, long hardened by the Alps, the marches, the blood of Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae, now lounged among feasts and fountains. Some Carthaginian officers warned against it. Comfort rots the blade, they said, and there was truth in that. In Capua, for the first time in years, Hannibal's momentum slowed. He sent emissaries north to Gaul, south to Greek cities in Magna Graecia, even across the sea to Macedon, where Philip V ruled. Hannibal sought a grand coalition, a wider war. He wanted pressure on Rome from all sides. Macedon responded with interest. So did some coastal Greek colonies, but few were ready to commit. Meanwhile, Rome wasn't idle either. It appointed new commanders, men who had seen Cannae and lived. Some had fled the field. Others had arrived too late to join the fight. But all of them had learned. Among them was Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who had come to be called the Sword of Rome, and a young but resolute Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would soon study Hannibal's every move like a disciple preparing to confront a god. Rome changed its tactics. No longer would they meet Hannibal in full-scale battle. They avoided open plains. They focused on harassment, attrition, containment. Fabius Maximus' old strategy of delay, the very one the Senate had once scorned, was now gospel. Roman armies would now shadow Hannibal, cut off his reinforcements, starve him of supplies. And it began to work. Hannibal's reach extended wide, but his grip weakened. He couldn't besiege Rome. He couldn't force the Senate to sue for peace. And the longer he remained in Italy, the more the land around him was stripped bare. Fields burned, roads destroyed, allies pressured. He struck where he could, winning small victories, ambushing convoys, keeping Rome off balance. But they were not canny. Inside his army, discipline began to shift. The Celts, whose loyalty was never firm, began deserting. The Spanish troops, who had traveled for years, grew homesick, their morale faltering. The Numidian cavalry remained deadly, but they too began questioning how long they would be asked to fight in a foreign land without reinforcements from Carthage. Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, tried to march from Iberia to join him with fresh forces, but was intercepted and defeated at the Metaurus in 207 BCE, his head thrown into Hannibal's camp as a warning. The trap was slowly reversing. Hannibal still controlled much of southern Italy, but it was a patchwork of fear and allegiance, not true conquest. And as Rome recovered, it began rebuilding its legions with terrifying efficiency. They now trained harder, fought smarter, deployed more flexibly. The lessons of Cannae were etched into their doctrine. Cohesion replaced rigid ranks. Coordination replaced blind charge. And above all, they never again allowed themselves to be surrounded. The memory of Cannae itself became a weapon, not for Hannibal, but for Rome. It hardened the Republic's resolve. It reminded every citizen, every recruit, every senator what happened when pride overruled caution. Rome never forgot the feeling of suffocation, of hopeless slaughter. And that memory fueled a machine of retaliation that would eventually cross the sea, burn across Africa, and turn Hannibal's own city into ruins. But at this point in time, in the years immediately after Cannae, Hannibal remained in Italy undefeated on the field. No Roman dared face him in full battle again. His presence haunted the peninsula like a specter. Mothers frightened children with his name. Commanders measured every maneuver against the standard he had set. His soldiers still revered him. He rode among them not as a general, but as a force of nature. Still, he waited for Carthage to send the final blow, waited for Rome to fall under its own weight, waited for alliances to shift, for the last cracks to appear in the Republic's armor. But Rome, scarred, maimed, vengeful, was no longer the same. Cannae had not broken it. It had remade it. Years passed. Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy, but the war had changed. The tides no longer moved with momentum, but with calculation. The chaos of Cannae had given way to a cold, grinding endurance test, and Rome was built for endurance. The Roman state became something different after Cannae, less trusting, more ruthless. Political power tightened. Commanders were no longer chosen for prestige, but for reliability, for competence, for their ability to obey the Senate and not their egos. The Republic had bled out nearly a generation of its elite on the fields of Apulia. It could not afford another. Meanwhile, Hannibal, still master of maneuver, adjusted as best he could. He struck garrisons, raided supply lines, and maintained a network of informants across central and southern Italy. But each campaign year became more difficult. Roman legions no longer engaged recklessly. They built fortified camps wherever they stopped, guarded their supply convoys with doubled escorts, and countered his every movement with stubborn resistance. His cavalry raids slowed. His freedom to forage diminished. Even in Capua, the city that had once welcomed him with fanfare, support began to falter. The luxurious winter quarters had dulled the edge of some of his men. Others resented being stationed in enemy territory for years with no sign of final victory. Hannibal tried to hold the army together through loyalty, through shared history, through charisma, but strain showed. Officers quarreled. Morale splintered. Promises from Carthage grew increasingly thin. Carthage, entangled in its own internal politics and threatened by Roman advances in Iberia, sent little support. Hannibal had to watch as Scipio's father and uncle campaigned across Hispania, taking one Carthaginian stronghold after another. The war widened, but not in his favor. Hannibal had once counted on Spain to funnel him troops and silver. Now he watched the stream slow to a trickle. He sent messages urging action, urging reinforcements. But the Senate in Carthage wavered, its will not matching his ambition. And Rome was learning to strike indirectly. When it couldn't beat Hannibal in Italy, it punished those who supported him. Towns that defected were crushed. Capua, after resisting Roman siege, was retaken. Its aristocracy executed. Its fields salted. Rome sent a clear message. Loyalty could be rewarded. Betrayal would be erased. Hannibal's Italian allies began to disappear. Some switched sides. Others fled. Each defection shrunk the map of his influence. Still, Hannibal did not leave. He could not. To retreat now would mean admitting failure. He had invested everything in this campaign. His name, his family's legacy, his army's lives. And then came news that shattered his hopes of reinforcement. Hasdrubal, his brother, slain at the Battle of the Metaurus in 207 BCE, his army destroyed, his head sent to Hannibal as a grotesque token of Rome's determination. There would be no second wave, no great unification of Carthaginian forces in Italy. Hannibal was now alone, yet he remained. He continued his campaign with brilliance, conducting ambushes, skirmishes, delaying Roman attempts to advance. For years he turned Italy into a chessboard, denying Rome total control. But time no longer favored him. Rome had rebuilt its strength. Its generals, hardened and sharpened by defeats, now matched his cunning. One among them, Scipio, the same boy whose father Hannibal had fought in Spain, was rising fast. Scipio took command in Iberia, crushed Carthaginian forces there, and turned westward. He did what Hannibal had once done, defied expectation. He convinced the Senate to let him carry the war to Africa. He landed near Carthage. Now it was Hannibal's homeland that burned. Panic struck Carthage. Suddenly, the Senate that had delayed aid to Hannibal demanded his return. He was called back, not as conqueror, but as savior. The general who had crippled Rome now sailed home to defend his own city. And so, in 203 BCE, after 15 years in Italy, Hannibal departed. He left behind a scarred peninsula, a legacy of unmatched battlefield mastery, and a war that had reshaped both Rome and Carthage. He left not because he was defeated, but because Rome had learned to outlast him. The Republic hadn't just survived Cannae. It had absorbed it, digested it, and grown stronger from its own dismemberment. When Hannibal landed in North Africa, it was not to lead a victorious return, but to prepare for the final confrontation. Rome had followed him home. The war that began in Italy would end on African soil. The sands of North Africa were dry with anticipation. When Hannibal disembarked on Carthaginian soil, the people did not cheer with triumph. They stared with silent urgency. Their greatest general had returned, but not as the spearhead of victory. He came as the last hope. Rome's armies, under the young but relentless Scipio, had crossed the sea. They were burning towns, dismantling alliances, forcing Carthage to look inward. For the first time in decades, the war was not in Iberia or Italy. It was here at Carthage's gates. Hannibal was now in his mid-40s. He was leaner, sterner, but still possessed that glint of fire that had terrified Rome for over a decade. He had fought more battles than most Roman commanders read about. But what he now faced was a different Rome, one forged in the crucible of his own victories. Scipio was not Vero. He wasn't Flaminius. He wasn't another arrogant senator playing at war. Scipio had studied Hannibal's every move. He had listened to survivors of Cannae. He had walked the ruins of cities Hannibal had devastated. And he had vowed not to make the same mistakes. Hannibal reorganized his army quickly. It was a mix of Carthaginian citizens, hastily armed levies, Libyan infantry, and some cavalry, plus a final, desperate shipment of war elephants. But the force lacked the cohesion of his Italian veterans. It had numbers but not unity. Time again was against him. In 202 BCE, near the town of Zama, the two titans met. The battlefield was different from Cannae. The terrain offered no clever bottlenecks, no flanking ridges, no hidden passes. It was open, equal. And this time, Rome came prepared. Scipio's army stood ready with battle-hardened Roman legions and Numidian cavalry led by Massinissa, once Hannibal's allies, now his enemies. The cavalry balance had shifted, and that mattered more than anything. At Zama, maneuver would determine fate. Hannibal began with a charge of 80 elephants, hoping to shatter the Roman front. But Scipio had planned for it. His men opened corridors in their lines, guiding the beasts through with trumpets and spears, then killing them from the flanks. The chaos Hannibal had once unleashed was now being turned back on him. Next came the infantry clash. Hannibal arranged his men in 3 lines, mercenaries in front, Carthaginian levies behind, and finally his core veterans brought back from Italy. At first, it mirrored Cannae. The first wave attacked fiercely, then fell back. But this time, the fallback didn't bait the Romans. It cluttered Hannibal's own lines. Miscommunication turned into confusion. His second line hesitated. The third, the veterans stood firm but isolated. Scipio pressed forward. His legions maintained formation, closing ranks when necessary, adjusting with precision. Less a sledgehammer, more a scalpel. The final confrontation came between the veteran corps, Hannibal's hardened Italians against Rome's rebuilt heart. It was brutal, grinding, and equal. For a time, it seemed Hannibal might hold. But then Massinissa's cavalry, having routed Hannibal's horsemen, returned from the flanks, just as Hannibal had done at Cannae. But this time the trap closed on him. The Romans encircled his third line. The noose he once wielded was now pulled around his own neck. Defeat. Zama was not a massacre like Cannae. It was measured, strategic, methodical. Rome had learned. Rome had adapted. And now, Rome would not let Hannibal slip away. Hannibal survived the battle. He returned to Carthage not in chains, but under shame. The city sued for peace. Rome imposed harsh terms. Loss of fleet, massive indemnities, surrender of all elephants, and no war without Roman permission. Carthage, once ruler of the Western Mediterranean, was now muzzled. Hannibal became a statesman, briefly. He reorganized Carthage's economy, paid off much of Rome's indemnity, reformed corruption. But the Romans never forgot. In time, they demanded his exile. He fled east, from one court to another, advising kings, evading capture. Always hunted, always remembered. And in 183 BCE, with Roman agents closing in, he took poison, his final act of defiance. "Let us now relieve the Romans of their fears," he said, and died alone. But the shadow of Cannae never died. It remained etched in Roman memory, military doctrine, and fear. For centuries, Roman generals studied Hannibal's tactics. They feared a new Cannae every time they stepped onto the field. Rome had defeated Hannibal, but only because Hannibal had first redefined what it meant to win. Cannae didn't end with the bodies buried or the standards reclaimed. It lingered, not in the soil, but in the mind of Rome. For generations, it remained the symbol of everything the Republic feared and revered. A victory so complete, so blindingly precise in its destruction, that it seared itself into military doctrine forever. In the aftermath of Zama and the death of Hannibal, Rome rose. No longer just a republic clinging to survival. It became an empire in mindset, determined not just to defend, but to dominate. The lesson of Cannae wasn't that defeat was possible. It was that overconfidence led to it. The Senate, once prone to bickering and prideful wagers, became ruthlessly efficient. Consuls were vetted more carefully. Campaigns were organized with deeper logistics. Rome would never again send a massive army into battle without knowing the terrain, the enemy, the variables. Cannae haunted every Roman field commander. It was taught in military academies, dissected by strategists, not because Rome wanted to replicate it, but because it wanted to prevent another. Legion structure was redesigned to allow flexibility in combat. The manipular system, which had failed at Cannae due to its rigidity, evolved. Cohorts replaced smaller maniples. Units could now respond to encirclement. Signals, formations, even the way orders moved down the chain of command, all were changed. And in that change, Rome began to win wars not just with numbers, but with adaptation. Future generals like Lucius Aemilius Paulus, not the consul who died at Cannae, but his son, took these lessons into Greece, crushing the Macedonian phalanx at Pydna not through brute force, but with fluid tactics. In Judea, in Gaul, in Britain, Roman armies outmaneuvered, outlasted, and outplanned because of what Hannibal had done. But Cannae also lived in the darker corridors of Roman policy. It justified brutality. It gave the Senate a reason to demand full submission from its enemies. If Rome ever doubted itself again, it remembered the day when 50,000 citizens died screaming, suffocating, buried alive beneath their comrades. That memory hardened the heart of the Republic. It made mercy a rarity. It showed in Carthage's end. After the Second Punic War, Carthage survived, but only just. It became a tributary, choked by indemnities, stripped of military capacity. Hannibal's legacy remained in its silence. For decades it endured. But when Rome, ever suspicious, saw it begin to recover, to rebuild trade, to find confidence, the Senate found a pretext. Cato the Elder ended every speech, no matter the topic, with the same phrase. Carthago delenda isti. Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BCE, Rome acted. The Third Punic War wasn't a war. It was an execution. Roman legions landed in Africa and laid siege to Carthage. The city resisted heroically with street battles, fires, desperate last stands. But the end was inevitable. In 146 BCE, after 3 years of siege, Carthage fell. The city was razed, its walls torn down, its people enslaved or slaughtered. Salt was not, as legend claims, sown into its fields, but might as well have been. Rome had not just beaten Carthage. It had erased it. The long shadow of Hannibal's genius had made Rome ruthless. And from that ruthlessness, empire grew. Centuries passed, but Cannae didn't vanish from memory. Julius Caesar read about it. He referenced it. He knew the danger of being outmaneuvered. He modeled his campaigns in Gaul not on Roman aggression, but on Hannibalic precision. He kept his legions mobile, flexible. At Alesia, Adrigovia, he surrounded rather than was surrounded. Later still, the military minds of the imperial era, Trajan, Germanicus, Severus, kept the spirit of Cannae in their strategy guides. But not all Roman commanders remembered. In 9 CE, In the Teutoburg forest, 3 Roman legions were ambushed and destroyed by Germanic tribes. Varus, the general, had forgotten what Hannibal had taught. Never march blind. Never underestimate terrain. Never assume victory. Cannae whispered even then. Much later, long after Rome itself had fallen, the study of Cannae continued. In the 19th and 20th centuries, European military academies taught it. Napoleon read it obsessively. Malka, the elder, patterned Prussian encirclement doctrine on it. German strategists used its principles in World War I at Tannenberg, and again in World War II during Operation Barbarossa. The double envelopment, once rare, became the holy grail of decisive battle. Yet what few understood, even centuries later, was that Cannae wasn't just brilliance. It was a horror, a nightmare of suffocation, of panic, of slaughter so total that no one could understand it without being there. The genius of the maneuver has been praised for generations, but few speak of the agony inside that ring of death. For Rome, it became more than memory. It became myth, not the kind that inspires songs, but the kind that whispers in the ears of generals before they sleep. Do not let it happen again. And in that whisper, Hannibal Barca lived on.